Court mocks sick Vietnam veteran over Agent Orange claims they didn't know who was about to walk in. Judge dismissed Vietnam veteran's Agent Orange case. Then his long-lost doctor walked into the courtroom. The courtroom fell silent as Thomas Wilson, a frail 72-year-old Vietnam veteran, stood alone against corporate lawyers in expensive suits. Little did they know the door behind them was about to open, changing everything. The federal district court in San Francisco gleamed with polished wood and marble, a temple to justice that felt cold and intimidating to Thomas Wilson. Outside, a light rain fell on the small group of veterans holding weathered signs, "Justice for Agent Orange Victims." Inside, the air conditioning hummed steadily, masking the labored breathing of Thomas as he clutched a worn folder containing medical records and faded photographs from his time in Vietnam. Thomas Wilson had once been strong, a farm boy from Iowa who could lift hay bales all day without tiring. Now his hands trembled constantly and mysterious rashes covered his arms. At night, he struggled to breathe, and during the day, headaches pounded behind his eyes. The doctors had given him a list of conditions: peripheral neuropathy, respiratory problems, skin disorders, and most recently, a rare form of lymphoma, all linked to Agent Orange exposure during his tour with the 101st Airborne Division in 1968-1969. Before Vietnam, Thomas had been engaged to his high school sweetheart, Mary. They had plans for a small farm and a big family. But when he returned, something had changed in him. The nightmares were only part of it. His body began betraying him in ways doctors couldn't explain. Mary stayed, but they never had children. His exposure had taken that possibility too. Now, 40 years later, with Mary gone, after a long battle with cancer, Thomas faced this fight alone. Despite everything, Thomas maintained a quiet dignity. His neighbors knew him as the man who still put up American flags along their street every Memorial Day, who volunteered at the VA hospital when his health permitted reading to veterans worse off than himself. The lawsuit represented Thomas's last hope. After decades of denied VA claims and mounting medical bills, he had joined a class action lawsuit against the chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange. But the case had been separated, with Thomas and a small group of veterans with similar conditions selected as test cases. Today was the preliminary hearing to determine if there was enough evidence to proceed. The chemical company's strategy was clear discredit the medical evidence, question the exposure levels, and paint the veterans as opportunists seeking payouts for conditions that could have other causes. 6 months earlier, Thomas had been sitting in his small apartment staring at yet another VA denial letter when the phone rang. It was a lawyer named Sarah Chin, a young attorney with the Veterans Legal Alliance. Her father had served in Vietnam too, and she had made it her mission to help veterans fight for recognition of their Agent Orange-related illnesses. "Mr. Wilson," she had said, "we're putting together a new approach to the Agent Orange cases. The science has advanced. We have new evidence about the chemical companies knowing more than they admitted. Would you be willing to be one of our test cases?" Thomas had hesitated. He had been through this before: the hope, the disappointment, the bureaucratic maze that led nowhere. But something in Sarah's voice, a determination that reminded him of Mary, made him say yes. "I don't have much time left," he told her. "But if it helps the younger guys, the ones who served in places where they used the same chemicals, I'll do it." Sarah worked tirelessly gathering Thomas's medical records, military service documentation, and details about his deployment locations. She cross-referenced them with recently declassified maps showing Agent Orange spray missions. The evidence was compelling. Thomas had been stationed in areas with the highest concentration of spraying during the peak of the chemical warfare program. "We need to find witnesses," Sarah explained during one of their preparation meetings. "Someone who can corroborate your exposure, ideally someone with medical credentials." Thomas shook his head. "Most of my unit is gone, and the medic who treated me after our first exposure, Dr. James Harrison, I lost track of him decades ago." Sarah made a note. "We'll try to locate him. In the meantime, we have scientific experts who can testify about the causal link between your conditions and the chemicals." Their first victory came when Judge Eleanor Simmons agreed to hear the case denying the chemical company's motion to dismiss. But at the initial hearing, Thomas got his first taste of what they were up against. "Your Honor," said Michael Reynolds, lead counsel for the Chemical Consortium, "the plaintiff cannot establish a clear causal link between his alleged exposure and his current medical conditions. The scientific literature shows multiple potential causes for his symptoms, many of which are simply age-related." Sarah countered with recent epidemiological studies and VA presumptive condition lists. But Judge Simmons seemed skeptical. "Ms. Chin," she said, peering over her glasses, "while I sympathize with Mr. Wilson's condition, this court requires more than correlation. You need to demonstrate that these specific companies' products directly caused these specific injuries." As they left the courtroom that day, Thomas felt the familiar weight of defeat. "They're too powerful," he told Sarah. "They've been fighting this for 40 years. They know how to win." Sarah squeezed his arm gently. "This was just the beginning, Mr. Wilson. We have more evidence to present. Don't give up yet." Sarah's team worked around the clock deposing scientists, tracking down military records and building their case. Thomas contributed by reaching out to his old veterans groups, finding 2 members of his former unit who could testify about the spray missions they witnessed. One breakthrough came when they obtained internal company memos through discovery. The documents revealed that as early as 1965, scientists at one of the chemical companies had raised concerns about dioxin contamination in Agent Orange and its potential health effects. "They knew," Thomas said quietly, holding the photocopied memo with trembling hands. "They knew, and they kept sending it to us anyway." Sarah nodded grimly. "This helps establish negligence. But we still need to connect it directly to your case." The local press picked up the story after their second hearing. A reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle interviewed Thomas, and his dignified bearing and straightforward account of his suffering resonated with readers. Veterans groups began showing up at the courthouse, and an online petition supporting the case gathered thousands of signatures. The chemical companies responded with a PR campaign of their own, emphasizing their contributions to agriculture and medicine and suggesting that the veterans' health problems could be attributed to other aspects of military service or lifestyle choices. "They're trying to paint you as a victim, looking for someone to blame," Sarah warned Thomas. "We need to stay focused on the evidence." Thomas nodded. "I've been called worse things than a victim, Sarah. I can handle it." Their first major victory came when Judge Simmons ruled that the internal company documents could be admitted as evidence. The defense attorneys immediately filed appeals and motions to limit the scope of the documents, but the judge held firm. "These records appear to indicate knowledge of potential harm," she stated. "Their relevance to the case is clear." For the first time, Thomas allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. That evening, he took out an old photo of his unit, looking at the young faces, many of whom were now gone. Some in combat, others from cancers and diseases that struck them too young. "We might actually win this, Mary," he whispered to the empty room as if his late wife could hear him. As the date for the evidentiary hearing approached, Sarah prepared Thomas for what would be his most difficult challenge, testifying and facing cross-examination. The defense would try to undermine his credibility, question his memory, and suggest alternative causes for his illnesses. "They'll bring up everything," Sarah warned. "Your smoking history, other jobs you've had, family medical history. They'll try to confuse you about dates and locations." They practiced for hours with Sarah playing the role of a hostile attorney. Thomas struggled at times, his memory clouded by age and illness. But his core story remained consistent. He had been healthy before Vietnam, had been directly sprayed with Agent Orange multiple times, and had begun experiencing symptoms shortly after returning home. "Just tell the truth," Sarah advised. "Don't try to remember details you're unsure about. It's okay to say you don't know." The night before the hearing, Thomas barely slept. He laid out his only suit, the one he had worn to Mary's funeral, and placed his service medals in his pocket. Not to show the court, but to remind himself of who he was and why this fight mattered. The evidentiary hearing began with scientific testimony. Expert witnesses presented conflicting interpretations of epidemiological studies. The defense experts emphasized the complexity of establishing causation, while the plaintiff's experts pointed to statistical patterns that couldn't be explained by chance. Then came Thomas's testimony. He spoke clearly about his experiences, the spraying missions he witnessed, and the progression of his health problems. For a moment, even the defense attorneys seemed moved by his dignity and lack of bitterness. But then the cross-examination began, and Michael Reynolds was merciless. "Mr. Wilson, you claim you were directly sprayed with Agent Orange, but your military records don't specifically mention any such incident, do they?" "We didn't report every spray mission, sir. They were routine." "And you smoked for 15 years after returning from Vietnam, correct?" "Yes, but I quit in 1985. "And your father died of cancer, did he not?" "Yes, but he was 82, not 55 when he was diagnosed." The questions continued, each designed to create doubt, to suggest alternative explanations. Thomas began to falter, his fatigue evident. Judge Simmons called for a brief recess, and Thomas slumped in his chair. "I'm hurting the case," he whispered to Sarah. "I can't remember all the details they're asking about." When the court reconvened, Reynolds continued his attack, focusing now on the specific locations where Thomas claimed to have been exposed. "You state you were in the A Shau Valley in March 1969 when spraying occurred, but these military records indicate your unit was stationed 20 kilometers away. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Thomas looked confused. I know we were there. We were on a special patrol." "So you're claiming the official military records are incorrect?" Before Thomas could answer, the courtroom door opened. A tall, white-haired man with military posture entered and spoke to the bailiff, who then approached the judge. After a brief whispered conversation, Judge Simmons looked up with surprise. "Counsel, we have an unexpected witness who claims to have relevant information. Dr. James Harrison, formerly a combat medic with the 101st Airborne Division." Thomas's eyes widened. "Doc Harrison," he whispered. The elderly doctor walked to the front of the courtroom. After being sworn in, he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but I read about this case in the paper yesterday. Thomas Wilson was under my care in Vietnam. I have information directly relevant to his exposure to Agent Orange." Reynolds immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We have no prior notice of this witness, no opportunity to review his testimony or credentials." Judge Simmons considered this. "Dr. Harrison, are you willing to submit to deposition before offering testimony in this case?" "Absolutely, Your Honor, and I've brought something else." He held up a weathered notebook. "My field medical journal. I kept detailed records of every man in my unit, including exposure incidents and subsequent symptoms. I documented 3 separate occasions when Thomas Wilson's patrol was directly sprayed with defoliants and the acute symptoms that followed." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Thomas stared at his former medic in disbelief. Judge Simmons banged her gavel. "Order!" Mr. Reynolds, Ms. Chen approached the bench. After a heated discussion, the judge announced that Dr. Harrison would be deposed immediately, with the hearing to resume the following day. As the court adjourned, Thomas made his way to Dr. Harrison. "Doc, I can't believe it's you. After all these years." The older man clasped Thomas's trembling hand in both of his. "When I saw your name in the paper, I knew I had to come. I've been carrying these records for decades, wondering if they'd ever matter. Maybe now they will." That evening, Sarah and her team worked frantically with Dr. Harrison, reviewing his medical journals and preparing him for the next day's testimony. The journals were meticulous, recording not just Thomas's exposures, but those of dozens of other soldiers, along with their symptoms and treatments. "I was studying epidemiology before I was drafted," Dr. Harrison explained. "I knew something wasn't right about those chemicals. The acute reactions were too severe, too consistent. So I documented everything, thinking someday someone would need to know." Thomas sat quietly listening to the doctor describe incidents that had haunted his nightmares for decades. The day their patrol had been caught in a direct spray from a C-123 aircraft. The night he had awakened with his skin burning and eyes swollen shut. The weeks of respiratory problems that followed. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Sarah asked gently. Dr. Harrison's face darkened. "I did. In 1978, during the first round of Agent Orange investigations, I submitted my journals to the VA committee. They thanked me and said they'd be in touch. I never heard from them again. When I followed up, they claimed they had no record of my submission." As they prepared to leave for court the next morning, Thomas pulled Sarah aside. "What if it's not enough?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What if they say he's just one doctor, one witness?" Sarah considered this. "Dr. Harrison's records corroborate exactly what you've been saying for years, and they document not just your case, but patterns across dozens of soldiers. That's powerful evidence. But the companies will say he could have fabricated it all recently. The journal is clearly aged, and he's willing to submit to forensic analysis of the paper and ink. Plus, he has nothing to gain from this, Thomas. He's putting himself at risk professionally, by coming forward against these powerful companies. Thomas nodded slowly. I just don't want to get my hopes up again. Sarah squeezed his arm. Whatever happens today, the truth is finally being heard. That matters. The courtroom was packed the next morning. News of Dr. Harrison's appearance had spread, and veterans groups had mobilized overnight. The gallery was filled with former servicemen, many in wheelchairs or with visible health problems similar to Thomas's. The chemical company's legal team had expanded with 3 additional attorneys, joining Reynolds at their table. They huddled together, occasionally glancing at Dr. Harrison with undisguised hostility. Judge Simmons called the court to order. Before we proceed with Dr. Harrison's testimony, I understand the defense has filed several motions overnight. Reynolds stood. Yes, Your Honor. We moved to exclude Dr. Harrison's testimony as prejudicial and unverified. We've had no opportunity to investigate his claims or authenticate his alleged medical journal. Sarah countered, Your Honor, Dr. Harrison has submitted to a full deposition as ordered. His credentials have been verified. He was indeed the medic assigned to Mr. Wilson's unit. The journal's authenticity can be established through forensic analysis, which we welcome. Judge Simmons denied the motion to exclude, but allowed the defense-wide latitude in cross-examination. Dr. Harrison took the stand and began methodically describing his observations in Vietnam. On March 17, 1969, Specialist Wilson's patrol returned from the A Shau Valley after being directly sprayed by herbicide from aircraft. 6 of the 8 men exhibited immediate symptoms: skin rashes, eye irritation, nausea, and respiratory distress. Reynolds' cross-examination was brutal. He questioned Harrison's memory, his motives, and his medical expertise. Dr. Harrison, you were a 23-year-old medic with basic training, not a toxicologist or epidemiologist. How can you possibly determine that these symptoms were caused by herbicides rather than jungle diseases, heat exhaustion, or other environmental factors? Reynolds demanded. Dr. Harrison remained composed. Because I documented identical symptom patterns in multiple units, all following direct spray exposure, the timing and consistency couldn't be coincidental, and I ruled out tropical diseases through standard diagnostic protocols. And yet, you never published these findings in any medical journal, never presented them at any scientific conference. I attempted to. My first submission was rejected because I lacked institutional backing. After the government's initial denial of Agent Orange effects, academic journals became reluctant to touch the subject. The turning point came when Sarah introduced a second piece of evidence, a letter Dr. Harrison had sent to one of the chemical companies in 1974, expressing concern about long-term health effects and requesting information about dioxin contamination in Agent Orange. And did you receive a response to this letter, Dr. Harrison? Sarah asked. Yes, a form letter stating their products were safe when used as directed and that military application was outside their control. Sarah then produced a recently declassified internal memo from the same company dated just 2 weeks after Harrison's letter. It read, "Recommend no response to medical inquiries regarding Vietnam herbicide exposure. Legal advises all such correspondence be forwarded to Defense Department." Judge Simmons leaned forward. Mr. Reynolds, was this document included in your discovery disclosures? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, we provided thousands of documents. If this particular memo was overlooked, "It wasn't in the discovery materials," Sarah interrupted. "We obtained it through a separate FOIA request to the Department of Defense." The judge's expression hardened. "I find this deeply troubling, Mr. Reynolds." In that moment, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Thomas, who had been watching silently, saw Judge Simmons's demeanor change as she began to view the case not just as another liability claim, but as a systematic effort to conceal evidence. Reynolds attempted to recover, calling a rebuttal witness, a retired military officer who testified that herbicide operations followed strict protocols to avoid exposing troops. But under Sarah's cross-examination, he admitted he had never served in a ground unit and had no first-hand knowledge of actual field conditions. As the final arguments concluded, Judge Simmons made an unusual announcement. "Before I rule on whether this case will proceed to trial, I want to address something. Courts function on evidence and procedure, but also on fundamental fairness. What I've seen today suggests a troubling pattern of concealment spanning decades." She looked directly at Thomas. "Mr. Wilson, your service and your suffering deserve recognition. Dr. Harrison, your commitment to your patients both during the war and by coming forward today is commendable." Turning to the defense table, her voice hardened. "Counsel, I am referring this matter to the court's discovery compliance officer for review of potential discovery violations. Additionally, I am ordering the immediate preservation of all documents related to Agent Orange knowledge and communications dating back to 1965. Judge Simmons ruled that Thomas's case could proceed to trial, denying the chemical company's motion for summary judgment. More significantly, she certified the case as a class action, meaning thousands of similarly affected veterans could join. The courtroom erupted in applause. Veterans in the gallery embraced each other, many with tears streaming down weathered faces. Thomas sat stunned, unable to fully process what had happened. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around them. Sarah handled most of the questions, but when someone asked Thomas how he felt, he simply said, "Today, I feel like someone finally heard us." The chemical company's representatives made no comment, but their grim expressions spoke volumes as they hurried to waiting cars. The ruling sent shock waves through the legal and corporate worlds. Within weeks, the chemical companies approached Sarah with settlement offers, first insulting, then serious. After consultation with Thomas and other class representatives, they agreed to terms substantial compensation for affected veterans, funding for ongoing medical research, and most importantly, to Thomas, a formal acknowledgement of the link between Agent Orange and the veteran's health conditions. Dr. Harrison's medical journals became the foundation for a new medical database tracking Agent Orange exposure effects, helping thousands of veterans qualify for benefits previously denied. The VA established new presumptive conditions based on the patterns documented in his records. For Thomas, the settlement meant financial security in his final years and the ability to leave something to his nieces and nephews. But more valuable was the vindication, the official recognition that he and his fellow soldiers had been telling the truth all along. 6 months after the settlement, Thomas and Dr. Harrison sat on Thomas's small porch watching the sunset. Both men knew Thomas's lymphoma was advancing rapidly. "I never thought I'd live to see it," Thomas said quietly. "All those years of being told it was in my head or just bad luck." Dr. Harrison nodded. I should have tried harder, found another way to get those records out. You did what you could, and you showed up when it mattered most. Thomas pulled an old photograph from his pocket, his unit in Vietnam, young men smiling despite everything. Most of these guys are gone now, but their families will know the truth. He handed Dr. Harrison a small box. Inside was one of his Purple Hearts. "I can't accept this, Thomas," the doctor protested. "You fought a different kind of battle, Doc, a longer one, and you won it for all of us." As the sun disappeared behind the distant hills, the two old soldiers sat in companionable silence, united by memories of a war that had never really ended for either of them, but which had at long last given them a measure of peace. Thomas Wilson passed away 3 months later. At his funeral, hundreds of veterans attended, many who had never met him, but whose lives were changed by his fight. Dr. Harrison delivered the eulogy, speaking not of Thomas's illness, but of his courage both in Vietnam and in the courtroom. The settlement money established the Thomas Wilson Foundation, providing support for veterans still struggling with Agent Orange-related conditions. And in a quiet corner of the Iowa Veteran Cemetery, a simple headstone bears not just his name and military service, but words that had taken a lifetime to prove true. He served with honor. He spoke the truth. He was heard.